the record button. Okay, that's good. That's starting. Well, welcome everyone. We've got quite a packed agenda to get through. I can just see another low pay commissioner arriving. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you ever so much. Bang on time.
Thank
Lovely.
you.
I'm Richard Goff. This is an Experts at Work webinar entitled "Where Next for Low Pay and the National Living Wage." And I'm very grateful to both to Matthew and to Leigh at the Low Pay Commission for all their work on this and help putting this together. Much appreciated. A big welcome to, firstly, Matthew Fell, as I say, who's Low Pay Commissioner, as well as Director of Competitiveness at Business London, who's going to start us off shortly with a quick recap in a moment on low pay and the Commission itself. And a welcome to no less than three other low pay commissioners. We've got Patricia Rice, who's a Senior Research Fellow at St Anne's College and at the Department of Economics at Oxford University. We've got Nigel Cottrove, who's a member of the Prison Service Pay Review Body and formerly a National Officer with the Communication Workers Union. And we've got Andrew Goodacre, who's CEO of the British Independent Retailers Association. I think we may have some members of the Low Pay Commission Secretariat as well. And as I say, welcome to them and to Leigh, who's been so helpful with this session. So this session is for members of all three of our networks. We're recording this session, as you saw. We've got breakout rooms for this one too, which will be the main part of this session because the Low Pay Commission are really keen to hear your views on a number of things. We've got some questions to run past you shortly, and more of that later. This is your chance to feedback to the Low Pay Commission, and we'll have breakout rooms in about 15-20 minutes time, something like that. Each breakout room will have a Low Pay Commissioner in it, and then followed by Q&A and feedback in the round for the last 15 minutes or so, with a half finish at 3 p.m. So do send us questions and suggestions throughout via the chat. And if you haven't put yourself on mute already, please do. That'd be much appreciated. And Matthew, I'm going to turn over to you. Thank you again.
Look, Richard, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, for giving us an hour of your time. It's hugely appreciated. Richard has done the first bit, which is to introduce my fellow commissioners, but great to see Patricia, Nigel and Andrew on the call, and we'll be slotting into your breakout groups very shortly. Look, just a few words from me to help set the scene ahead of that. Hopefully you will all know a reasonable amount about the Low Pay Commission. But we're a social partnership model, so we have representation on the Commission from the employee perspective, the employer perspective, and the independent expert academics, of which Patricia is one of those. So you've got each of those three constituent groups represented with the pool of commissioners on the call today. Second point to note is, look, as you will know, we are independent of government, but we make recommendations to the government on what we think the national living wage should be each year. And our task is essentially to make recommendations about that headline rate, but also some of the more age-specific rates, the apprenticeship rate, and depending on the sector you're in, you will either know lots of details about something called the accommodation offset or nothing at all about it. And if you're in that latter camp, please don't let me trouble with you any further. But those are the things that we have responsibility for. And look, we go about this task, we get, as you would imagine, no shortage of economic data over the course of this year through Leigh's colleagues on the Secretariat at the Low Pay Commission, who equip us with all of that latest data and so on. But also we invest a lot of time getting out and about around the country, talking to stakeholders, groups such as this, representatives of both workers in low paying sectors, employers in different parts of the economy, who all give us their perspectives as well. And then that essentially goes into the hopper where we make our deliberations, coming up quite shortly now in actual fact, typically in around about mid-October each year, where all of the commissioners convene with a rate-setting retreat each year. We deliberate and we reach a consensus, all being well, we have done every year so far, on what we think the recommended rate should be to government, and then that gets announced shortly afterwards in the government's sort of fiscal event of the autumn. So that is the process. Final thing, Richard, I thought I would share just before we sort of get going on the discussion areas is just a very brief history in terms of what has taken us to the sort of this point right now. And look, if you cast your minds back, you'll recall former chancellors, initially George Osborne and then Philip Hammond back in 2019, set a target for the Low Pay Commission to achieve 2/3 of median wages by 2024. So a 5-year time horizon. And that is the number that we arrived at in April of this year. And look, each of you will have experienced this in your own companies and sectors because of strong wage growth in the economy over the last few years. That rate actually crept higher than we might have initially thought in order to hit the 2/3 median. And no doubt you will all be very well aware from a company perspective that has been painful for some. And similarly, when we talk to workers in some of the lower paying sectors, it's been a painful time for them as well, because they've said back to us in ordinary times, perhaps, increases of the order of magnitude that we've seen, around about 10% each year for the last couple of years, would have felt quite a good increase in pay. But the reality is that has been more than swallowed up by cost of living increases on their behalf too over the last couple of years. So it's not been an easy journey to get there on both sides of the equation, but that is where we are today. And then I fast forward and bring us right up to date. You will all be very well aware we have a new government and we now have a new remit for the Low Pay Commission. And that is available publicly. So look, please do dive in and have a look at the detail. But essentially, to pick out the sort of key component parts of that, I would say, one, they've asked us to ensure that the rate doesn't drop below that 2/3 median of wages in the economy. So that's a floor, essentially. I think point two, the new factor is we've been asked to place greater emphasis and take into account the cost of living alongside the effects on employment and developments in the wider economy when we go about our decisions on setting the national living wage. And then thirdly, and over time, we've been asked to remove the age bands down to 18, but that is, I stress, over time. And this year, our remit asks us to continue to make recommendations on what the rates should be for 18 to 20-year-olds too. So that is something that we will get stuck into in the future, but it's not in this current cycle with the recommendations to come into effect for April next year. But the big new factor is that cost of living issue. And look, with that, Richard, I think the things that we would most find helpful to get your feedback and intelligence on today are, firstly, understanding from your own company and sector what has been the impact in recent years of those rises and the steps that you have taken to then absorb them in your own company. Is it a combination of cost cutting elsewhere? Is it passing on price increases through to customers, efficiency gains elsewhere in the business, and so on and so forth? So firstly, the sort of your reaction to those, what impact has it had, and how have you gone about absorbing them? Second, very pertinent for what's coming up right now, your advice and recommendations on what you think we should be doing this year in terms of any future rises and their affordability or otherwise would be extremely helpful. And then third, this new dimension that we've got to play with, the cost of living factor. Any advice or thoughts you have on how we should be interpreting that part of our remit, given that it is new, would be extremely helpful for us, and particularly to understand the extent to which that already features and factors in your own pay settlements in your own organisations, the sort of thought process you go through to reflect that, and any advice that has that's relevant for us would be really, really good to hear too. So look, Richard, those were the 3 points essentially: understanding the impact of recent rises, advice on what we should do this year, and how we should be thinking about cost of living. Those are 3 elements that would be really helpful to get some feedback on in the breakout groups over the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes or so. And if we could head off into those groups, each of us, as I say, will appear. So happy to take any follow-up questions, points of clarification in those groups. And then we'll maximise the airtime for all of you, get some views in. And I think, Richard, then the plan is we'll return to plenary for the last 15 minutes or so and hopefully be able to get a few headline readouts from that.
What a beautiful explanation, Matthew. Thank you so much. Yes, exactly. And spot on with the questions which are in the chat. So I've allocated 4 rooms. Now, I don't know whether to be alarmed or impressed by this, but I set up the breakout rooms thinking I'd have to add in the commissioners, and it's automatically added you 1 to each room. So either AI has suddenly got even more sophisticated in a slightly sinister way, or it's just fluke. Either way, we'll open up the breakout rooms now. We'll have half an hour, and we'll go towards 2:45, as Matthew says. Thank you ever so much. Thanks, Matthew. Welcome back, everyone. We've just hit recording again. I hope that was a useful conversation. They look like they were from my point of view at least, so I hope they were from yours. Please do feedback on the chat or raise your hand if you'd like to make a point. Love to hear from you. Before, that's my general request, as it were. I just wanted to also turn to the low pay commissioners, as we're lucky enough to have 4 of you on the call. Just wanted to ask you, was there anything that you feel we didn't have time for? Any points missed? Anything you'd like to put to the wider group that wasn't perhaps explored in your own breakout rooms? Anything?
I was just I mistimed. I was explaining to my group how we come to the ultimate recommendation. I was just explaining that there's employee commissioners, and independent commissioners, academics, and it's towards the end of October that we lock ourselves away and negotiate, because employers will have a different perspective to employees and may have a different perspective to the independents. My first year doing it, Matthew's done it for 2 or 3 years. He's probably better placed to fully explain it. But the idea is that you get a balanced approach to the recommendation. And it's based on what we've heard both through these consultations. It's based on information gathering that we're doing, not just in the UK, but Europe and other areas of the world where these conversations are having now as well in their respective countries. So it really is a very thorough process. And that's one thing I would say in my first year. The one thing I've been reassured by is how thorough this process is.
Thanks, Andrew. That's useful to know. In fact, let's just turn to Matthew for me. Is this giving you what you need, Matthew? Thanks again for the idea.
Yeah, no, I'm sure all the other groups had good discussions too, very rich from my point of view. I mean, look, if it's helpful just to share a few of the sort of points that started to come across it in the discussion, I think that firstly, everyone had their own version of this, but certainly we had an example in the luxury retail sector where their experiences in the broader economy are sales are now roughly back to where they were a few years ago, but that's nothing like reflected in profit levels, given that the sort of increased cost base in the round, of which employment is a factor. So that was sort of one in terms of the base level, and then the sort of the environment essentially that these increases are pitching into, and that's getting increasingly difficult. I think then secondly, we had quite a bit of a chat just around the sort of cost of living element, and 2 thoughts are really that prompted further thought for me. One is how we manage to sort of either deduplicate or avoid double counting of what employers are already doing in the round versus what we might be additionally asked to do as a low pay commission. And then as a sort of plot twist against that, we had a little mini conversation about what's the impact of hybrid working, and that obviously changes the dynamic slightly depending on people's ability to do that or not, depending on the different roles. The cost of living, the cost of travel to work, etc., changes quite dramatically depending on that. So no great answers, Richard, but it was an extra little head scratcher that I shall go away and ponder.
Fair enough. Thanks, Matthew. Nice summary. What were people recommending?
In terms of future rates and so on.
Sorry, or anything really.
No, I don't think anyone was bold enough to give us an exact number, but I think expectations were more calibrated around what are we seeing pay settlements in the round. I mentioned in my group, for example, given where pay settlements have continued to be relatively strong, keeping pace with that 2/3 of median pay would probably equate to ballpark about 5% increase. And I was then at pains to say that don't by any way take any indication from that. That's definitely a recommendation or anything like that. That was just this is how the numbers are sort of playing out, given what's happening in the labour market.
We had an interesting debate in our group about, or a bit of a debate around having a year of not having a big increase and a year of settling down and a year of letting employers try and re-establish grade differential pay, because they've been squeezed over the last 2 years particularly. We didn't come to a figure or a consensus, but we did have a bit of a debate around that.
Got you. Yeah, interesting, Nigel. Thank you.
Oh,
sorry, go on.
Well, I was just going to say in my group, I think one of the things, it's something that we're very familiar with in the Low Pay Commission, is the contrast between those who are operating in sectors where you have some capacity to pass through increases in labour costs into your prices. And those sectors where essentially you're taking prices very often from some part of the public sector, so local authorities for social care or the health service or something like that, and you're having to respond to an increase in labour costs where your output price is essentially fixed as far as you're concerned. And obviously that's a very different situation to manoeuvre in. I thought that's something we often hear, and that was confirmed. The other thing I would add is I think there was a really good appreciation with our group of the sort of complications that open up once you start thinking about taking into account cost of living. That it is actually a lot more complex than just maybe jacking up the living wage according to some price index, but it's actually a much richer set of issues that we have to address than that. And whether you could ask a single national living wage to do the job is a moot point, I think.
Tell us more about the complications, Patricia. That sounds a really interesting point.
Well, I mean, there was a discussion about something like the Real Living Wage Foundation, Real Living Wage, where they try evaluate a basket of goods. But then, of course, the appropriate basket of goods depends on your household. You know, which household structure should we be looking at in order to determine the basket of goods to come up with a national living wage? Should it be single people? Should it be a married couple? Should it be a couple with children? Whose basket should we be looking at? And somebody raised the point about, well, what about different regions of the country where housing costs and prices are very different? So, you know, how do you get around those complications when you start thinking about cost of living?
Makes a lot of sense. Thanks, Patricia. What struck other people, whether things that weren't necessarily mentioned in the group, or they were, and you'd like to hear more about them, or simply just to make the point in the wider context? I'd love to hear from you.
Richard, one of the conversations we had, and this isn't necessarily something the Commission can address on their own, but is the complexity going back to, you know, can one number really do the job when you've got to take account of things like pension and the impact of, you know, having to move people out of salary sacrifice into tax at source, and also looking at things like the apprentice levy as levers that can be used, which are, you know, currently not being used well in order to help people out of poverty. So it's very difficult to look at one number and expect it to do everything, when actually there's a much more sort of rounded picture that needs to be taken account of, and to what extent the Commission can then work with those other decision-making bodies to kind of factor that in.
Yeah, got you, Julia. Thank you. Not really necessarily germane to the LPC, perhaps, but you mentioned the apprenticeship levy. Underused, you feel?
Totally. I mean, there's millions and millions and millions of pounds going back to HMRC that is not being used because people either don't understand the rules, don't use it. And, you know, if you look at some of our lowest paid employees, the way they are most likely to get out of, you know, the situation of being on the minimum wage is through career progression. And that career progression is available, but it's not, I mean, I don't think we do it well enough. And a lot of organisations aren't doing it well enough in terms of knowing how and when to be able to apply that to enable people to move through. And because of the way it's structured, it's not structured in such a way as making it easy to support people and then increase salaries on the back of their training.
Thank you very much. Just wanted to turn to Deborah, if I may, because you made a really good point about the increase in wages and margins specifically, if I understand that correctly. Deborah Weisglass? Deborah, hello, sorry. I think you're on mute there. Deborah, I can't hear you. Is it just me?
No, I can't hear.
That better?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. My mic was on the top of my head. Not very helpful. Sorry, Richard, which point were you saying about what I just put in the chat, or about? Yeah.
About not being able to pass prices on, yeah.
Yeah, I think we just need to be careful about assuming that by increasing wage, and that, you know, I'm certainly not anti making sure that people can afford to live at all, but it does get to the stage with businesses where we can't assume that we can just pass on increases onto the customer, because then the customer, particularly in retail, can choose to go somewhere else, And we've seen, I'm working in the department store sector. We've seen some very big scale failures of businesses. And I'm not suggesting it's because of that reason, but it's a very precarious, retailers in particular. Well, I'm sure there are other businesses that are too, but it's one I know about. It's a very precarious sector at the moment, and we're seeing lots of retailers fail. And we just have to be careful about assuming that we can increase costs at a staff level. It's one of the biggest costs, obviously, in a retail business in particular. That if it's not just as simple as being able to pass it on, particularly at the moment because of the external headwinds that we have, where we have increase in prices in supply chain, increases of cost of goods, increases of gas, and then also all of the new sustainability legislation all has to be paid for, need more capital investment in, like especially if you've got a big old listed building like Selfridges, the cost of trying to make that the heating of that more sustainable, for example. All of these are huge pressures that businesses are facing, and ultimately we want to make sure that we've got a sustainable business that can carry on employing people, as well as making sure that people, obviously balancing that with individuals being able to have a good standard of living. So it's just a very precarious mix that we need to take into consideration, and it's not an easy situation from an employer point of view as well.
I think that just emphasises, Deborah, that you have this whole spectrum of businesses that are going to be responding to the national living wage with one extreme, firms that can pass it through quite easily, and at the other extreme, firms that aren't able to change their output prices at all. I
would just challenge that, though, to that yes, you can pass through the prices, but it's not easy to do that because it's a huge decision in terms of the impact of the business and being able to attract the customers, because customers will just choose to go somewhere else. We're all customers.
Okay. We could argue about this all afternoon, so we won't. So I take your point. Obviously, it's easier for.
Well, I'm seeing quite a lot of nods, I think, in the room of people as well.
For some businesses than others, let's say that.
I think it's absolutely correct that obviously if you're in a situation where you are particularly a government employee, that the money's just going round. It's the same money. It's the same money going around to different places. Completely understand that, but you also have to see it from the private sector point of view, that it is also about staying in business, because shareholders can choose to put their money wherever they want, and that they will seek to make sure that they're securing their profit. And if they don't want to invest in a business that they don't think is going to make money, they'll just move it to somewhere else. So it's not easy. I take the point, it's possible, but I dispute that it's a challenge that it's easy.
No, fair enough, Deborah. And obviously the margin sensitivity, famously so in retail, but also in other sectors as well. So a point well making. And Patricia, thanks for coming back on that. One last thought from low pay commissioners? Well, let's just end then.
Richard, I think that just on behalf of all of us, just huge thanks to everyone for engaging over the last hour. I think I've certainly been scribbling away. I suspect colleagues have as well. And that gives us plenty of food for thought as we head into the sort of final lap as we approach our decision-making retreat next month.
Good luck with that. I really appreciate everyone's input. Low patient commissioners, thanks so much for coming along. Leigh, thanks for all your help in setting up the session as well. We'll see you again soon, and see you at a peak conversation later this month, everybody. Thanks, network members.
Thanks, Richard. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.